Don't touch that box, or I swear I'll disappear before sunrise." Evelyn Harper's voice cracked as she pulled the wooden chest tighter against her chest, her knuckles white, her eyes darting toward the road behind her like she expected shadows to come alive. Nathan Walker froze mid-step, hands still outstretched. He had traveled 3 hours for a bride. What he got instead was a woman running from something far bigger than a broken engagement, and he was about to find out exactly how far he was willing to go to protect her secret. If you love stories about strength, second chances, and love found in the most unexpected places, hit that subscribe button right now and stay with me until the very end. And do me a favor, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The stagecoach rolled into Silver Creek a little past 4 in the afternoon, dust curling behind its wheels like smoke from a dying fire, and every person standing near the depot turned to watch it come to a stop. Nathan Walker stood apart from the small crowd, his hat pulled low, his boots planted firm in the dirt, his jaw tight with a nervousness he refused to let anyone see. He had told himself all morning that this was nothing more than a practical arrangement. A wife to run the house, a partner to share the work. Someone who wouldn't leave him standing alone in an empty kitchen every night listening to the wind talk to itself. That was the story he'd told himself. But standing there watching the door of the stagecoach creak open, his heart pounded like he was about to meet a stranger who already knew every secret he had. The driver climbed down, first tipping his hat toward the small gathering of townsfolk who had nothing better to do than watch the arrival of Silver Creek's newest bride. Then came a gloved hand reaching for the frame of the door, and a moment later, Evelyn Harper stepped down onto the dirt street of the only town she would call home for the rest of her life. She was not what anyone expected. There was no nervous smile, no searching eyes looking for the man who had written her letters, no soft blush of a woman stepping into a new chapter of her life. Instead, her eyes moved fast, scanning the street, the buildings, the faces, like she was counting exits. Like she was looking for danger before she allowed herself to feel anything else. In one hand, she carried a single worn suitcase, its leather cracked and faded from years of travel. But it was her other arm that caught every eye in town. Wrapped tight against her body, held like it contained the last breath of air on earth, was a small wooden chest. Old, sturdy, locked with an iron clasp that looked like it had been polished 1,000 times by nervous hands. Nobody reached for it. Not because they didn't want to help a woman carrying too much luggage, but because the moment anyone took half a step toward her, her entire body tensed like a spring ready to snap. Nathan approached, slowly removing his hat, as he walked the same way his father had taught him to approach a spooked horse. Calm steps. No sudden movement. Let the frightened creature decide when it was ready to trust you. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm Nathan Walker." She looked at him for the first time, and something flickered behind her eyes. Assessment, maybe. Calculation. The look of someone deciding in half a second whether a person was safe or dangerous. "Yes," she said. "I'm Evelyn." He nodded toward her suitcase. "Let me help you with that." Her arm tightened instinctively around the wooden chest. "Don't touch that box." She said the words rushing out sharper than she intended. The crowd nearby went quiet. A few heads turned. Nathan's hand, already halfway extended, stopped in the air. He could have laughed it off. He could have made a joke the way some men might to ease the tension and make himself look easy and unbothered in front of the town. But something about the fear behind her words told him this wasn't a moment for jokes. So he simply lowered his hand and said, "All right, it's yours." That was all. No question. No demand for an explanation. No look of suspicion. Just acceptance. And for a woman who had spent years learning that every person who ever noticed her gift eventually wanted to take it from her, those 4 words hit her harder than she expected. She blinked, caught off guard by her own reaction, and quickly looked away before he could see the emotion crossing her face. "Thank you," she said quietly. Nathan reached instead for her suitcase, leaving the wooden chest untouched in her arms, and gestured toward the wagon waiting near the edge of the street. "We've got a bit of a ride ahead of us," he said. "Ranch is about 3 hours out. I hope that's all right. It's fine, Evelyn said, though her eyes were already moving past him, studying the road, the buildings, the distant tree line, like a woman memorizing an escape route before she'd even unpacked. Nathan noticed. He noticed everything about her, in fact, in a way that surprised him. He wasn't a man who typically paid close attention to details, but something about Evelyn Harper made him watch closely the way you watch a storm cloud on the horizon, uncertain whether it will pass quietly or break into something dangerous. They climbed into the wagon in silence, the wooden chest settled carefully on Evelyn's lap. Her fingers still curled protectively around its edges. As the horses pulled them out of town, Nathan tried to make conversation the way he imagined a husband was supposed to. "You had a long trip," he said. "Where'd you travel from?" "East." Evelyn answered simply. "Whereabouts east?" She hesitated. "Does it matter?" Nathan glanced sideways at her, surprised by the defensiveness in her tone, but he didn't push. "No," he said. "Guess it doesn't." They rode in silence for a while. After that, the wagon creaking beneath them, the Montana plains stretching wide and gold under the afternoon sun. Nathan kept his eyes on the road, but every so often he found himself glancing at the woman beside him, trying to understand the puzzle sitting quietly at his side. It didn't take long before he noticed something strange. Evelyn wasn't just staring blankly at the landscape the way most newcomers did, overwhelmed by the size of the open country. She was watching, really watching. Her eyes moved from the horses pulling the wagon to the cattle grazing in a distant field, to a group of wild mustangs running along a ridge half a mile away. "You know horses?" Nathan asked, unable to hide his curiosity. Evelyn's gaze snapped toward him, guarded. "Why do you ask? You're watching them the way a rancher watches them, not the way most folks do." For a moment she said nothing. Then carefully, like she was choosing every word with precision, she said, "I grew up around animals." "That Mustang on the ridge," Nathan said, nodding toward the distant horse. "See how she's favoring her back leg." Evelyn's eyes sharpened, studying the horse for a long moment. "She's not injured," Evelyn said quietly. "She's protecting a foal. Probably hiding it in the brush nearby." Nathan blinked, surprised. He'd lived on this land his whole life, and it had taken him years to learn to read animals the way Evelyn had just done in seconds, as if it were as natural to her as breathing. "How'd you know that?" Evelyn's jaw tightened, and she looked away, her fingers gripping the edge of the wooden chest a little tighter. "I just do," she said, closing the conversation as firmly as a locked door. Nathan didn't press further, but the seed of curiosity had already been planted deep inside him. By the time the ranch came into view, a modest but sturdy homestead surrounded by open fields and a weathered barn standing tall against the horizon, the sun had begun its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep red. Evelyn stepped down from the wagon and stood still for a moment, taking in the sight of her new home. It was nothing like the crowded streets and towering buildings she had left behind. It was quiet here, open, isolated in a way that made her chest loosen just slightly, as if the distance itself offered a kind of protection she hadn't felt in years. Nathan watched her reaction carefully. "It's not much," he said, "but it's honest work and an honest life." Evelyn turned to him, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. "Honest is more than I've had in a long time," she said quietly. Nathan didn't know what that meant, not yet, but the weight behind her words told him there was a story buried deep beneath the surface of the calm, careful woman standing in front of him. That night, after a simple dinner, shared mostly in silence, Nathan showed Evelyn to her room, a modest space with a single window overlooking the fields. "If you need anything," he said, "I'm just down the hall." Evelyn nodded, still holding the wooden chest against her body even as she prepared to sleep. "Thank you," she said, "for not asking questions." Nathan paused at the door. "Everyone's got a right to their own history," he said. "Long as you're not bringing trouble to my ranch, your past is your business." Evelyn's throat tightened, and for a moment she looked like she might cry. "I hope you still feel that way," she whispered, "if my past ever finds me." Nathan frowned slightly, but before he could ask what she meant, she had already closed the door, leaving him standing in the hallway with more questions than answers. The following morning, Nathan woke before sunrise as he always did, moving quietly through the house to begin his chores. He expected to find Evelyn still asleep, exhausted from her long journey. Instead, he found her already outside, standing near the barn, watching his oldest horse with an expression of quiet concern. "Morning," Nathan said, stepping outside. Evelyn didn't turn immediately. Her eyes stayed locked on the old mare standing near the fence, her ears drooping slightly. Her weight shifted unevenly onto 3 legs. "This horse," Evelyn said. "How long has she been standing like that?" Nathan frowned, walking closer. "Old Bessie? She's just getting up in years. Vet says there's not much to be done for her anymore." "She's in pain," Evelyn said simply. "She's old," Nathan repeated, though there was less certainty in his voice now. Evelyn approached the horse slowly, her movements calm and deliberate, the same careful steps Nathan had used the day before when approaching her. She placed her hand gently on the horse's neck, and the animal surprisingly did not pull away. "Easy, girl," Evelyn whispered. "I'm not here to hurt you." Nathan watched arms-crossed skepticism written plainly across his face. He had seen every rancher and healer in the county examine this horse over the past year, and none of them had found anything beyond old age. But Evelyn wasn't examining the horse the way a veterinarian might, searching for obvious wounds or symptoms. She was listening. Her hand moved slowly along the horse's jaw, pausing when the animal flinched slightly. "There," Evelyn murmured almost to herself. "Right there." "What is it?" Nathan asked, stepping closer despite himself. "Her tooth," Evelyn said. "Back molar. It's cracked, probably infected. That's why she's not eating properly, and that's why she's shifting her weight. She's trying to avoid putting pressure on that side of her jaw when she chews, and it's throwing off her whole gait." Nathan stared at her, stunned into silence. "Nobody said anything about her teeth," he finally said. "Because nobody looked," Evelyn replied. "Everyone assumed she was old and gave up looking for anything else. But animals don't complain the way people do. They show you what's wrong if you're patient enough to notice." Nathan studied the old mare for a long moment, then looked back at Evelyn with an expression somewhere between disbelief and awe. "You could be right," he admitted. "But even if you are, there's no vet worth trusting for 100 miles who could fix that kind of problem out here." "I can," Evelyn said quietly. Nathan blinked. "You—" Evelyn hesitated, glancing briefly toward the house, toward the room where her wooden chest sat locked and hidden beneath her bed. "I've done it before," she said carefully. "I'll need some tools and time, but I can help her." Nathan studied her for a long moment. There was something in her voice, something between confidence and fear, like she was revealing a piece of herself she had promised never to reveal again. "All right," he said finally. "Do what you need to do, Ja." Over the following days, Evelyn worked patiently with the old mare, using tools she fashioned herself from what she found around the ranch, treating the horse's tooth with a precision and calm that left Nathan speechless every time he watched her work. Word began to spread through Silver Creek almost immediately. A neighboring rancher, hearing rumors about the healing bride on the Walker Ranch, arrived one afternoon with a sick calf that had been refusing to eat for nearly a week. "Figured I'd ask before giving up entirely," the rancher, a weathered man named Samuel Briggs, said, eyeing Evelyn with obvious skepticism. "Heard you've got a gift with animals." Evelyn's shoulders tensed at the word gift, but she said nothing, simply walking over to examine the calf. Within minutes, she identified the problem, a minor digestive blockage caused by the animal ingesting something toxic from a nearby field, and offered a simple remedy that had the calf eating again by the following morning. Samuel returned the next day, hat in hand, gratitude written plainly across his weathered face. "I don't know how you knew what was wrong," he said, "but you saved that calf's life. What do I owe you?" Evelyn shook her head firmly. "Nothing," she said. "I don't take payment for this." Samuel frowned, confused. Ma'am, that's mighty generous, but please, Evelyn interrupted, her voice suddenly sharp with an intensity that surprised everyone present. I don't want money for this. Just let people know an animal's suffering is unnecessary if someone's willing to look closely enough. Nathan, standing nearby, watched this exchange with growing curiosity, but he said nothing until Samuel had left, tipping his hat gratefully toward Evelyn before riding off. You could be making good money doing this, Nathan said carefully once they were alone. Evelyn's expression darkened her eyes, drifting toward the direction of the house, toward the hidden wooden chest once again. Some things aren't meant to make someone rich, she said quietly. Why not? Nathan asked. Evelyn was silent for a long moment, staring out at the open fields, her jaw tight with an old, unspoken pain. Because the last time someone realized what I could do, she said finally, they tried to own me for it. The words hit Nathan harder than he expected, and for the first time he began to understand that the woman standing beside him wasn't simply hiding a secret. She was hiding a wound. As the weeks passed, life on the Walker Ranch began to change in ways neither Nathan nor Evelyn could have predicted. Word of Evelyn's talent spread through Silver Creek and the surrounding countryside like wildfire, and soon ranchers from miles away were arriving with sick horses, injured cattle, and animals that veterinarians had already given up on. Evelyn helped every single one, refusing payment, each time insisting only that people trust the value of patience and observation over quick judgment. Nathan watched all of this unfold with a mixture of pride and confusion. He had married a stranger expecting nothing more than companionship, and instead, he found himself living alongside a woman capable of something he had never witnessed before, a kind of quiet, humble genius that seemed to exist entirely outside the woman's own awareness of how remarkable it truly was. But even as their ranch flourished and their reputation in Silver Creek grew, Nathan noticed that Evelyn never fully relaxed. She still flinched at unexpected visitors. She still kept the wooden chest locked beneath her bed, checking its clasp obsessively before falling asleep each night. And she still refused every single time to discuss where she had come from or why she had left. One evening, sitting together on the porch after a long day of work, Nathan finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been building inside him for weeks. Evelyn, he said carefully, what's in that chest? Evelyn's entire body went rigid. Nathan, I'm not asking to take it from you, he said quickly, raising his hands. I want to understand you. I want to know why a woman with a gift like yours is so afraid to let anyone see it fully. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the darkening horizon, her hands folded tightly in her lap. My grandfather, she said finally, spent his entire life studying animals, not through books written by scholars in universities, but through years and years of watching, listening, learning things no one else bothered to learn. He wrote it all down, every observation, every remedy, every lesson. That's what's in the chest, Nathan asked quietly. Evelyn nodded, her eyes glistening in the fading light. His life's work, she said. The only thing I have left of him. And someone wanted to take it from you, Nathan said, piecing the puzzle together slowly. Evelyn's hands trembled slightly. Someone believed it belonged to them, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Because they paid for my time. Because they thought my knowledge was something they could buy the same way they bought horses and land and everything else in their life. Nathan's jaw tightened with an anger he hadn't expected to feel. Who? He asked. Evelyn shook her head firmly. It doesn't matter anymore. Evelyn, please, she said, her voice cracking slightly. I've spent years running from this. I don't want to bring that fear into this house, into your life. Nathan studied her for a long moment, his heart aching at the sight of a woman so strong, so capable, and yet so deeply afraid of her own worth. You already have, he said gently. The moment you got off that stagecoach, you brought your whole life into this house, whether you meant to or not. And I'm not scared of your past, Evelyn. I just don't want you carrying it alone anymore. Evelyn looked at him, tears finally slipping free down her cheeks, and for the first time since arriving in Silver Creek, she allowed herself to lean just slightly into the comfort of another person's presence. "Thank you," she whispered. Nathan wrapped his arm gently around her shoulders, and for a long while they sat together in silence, watching the stars emerge over the quiet Montana ranch that had slowly, unexpectedly become the first place Evelyn had ever felt safe enough to call home. But even as the tension between them eased, a quiet unease lingered in the back of Nathan's mind. Because somewhere out there, the man from Evelyn's past was still searching. And it was only a matter of time before he found her. Dum-dum. 3 days later, that fear became reality. Nathan was repairing a section of fence near the front of the property when he noticed a fine, expensive carriage rolling up the long dirt road leading to the ranch, a sight so out of place in Silver Creek that several ranch hands stopped their work entirely just to stare. The carriage came to a stop near the house, and a well-dressed man stepped down, brushing dust from an expensive coat that clearly did not belong to a man accustomed to frontier life. He removed his hat, revealing sharp eyes and a practiced, charming smile that immediately set Nathan on edge. "Afternoon." The stranger called out, his voice smooth and confident. "I'm looking for the owner of this ranch." "That'd be me," Nathan said, setting down his tools and walking toward the man, his instincts already prickling with suspicion. "Nathan Walker. Can I help you with something?" The stranger's smile widened. "Richard Blackwood," he said, extending a gloved hand. "I've come a long way to find someone very important to me." Nathan shook the man's hand cautiously. "And who might that be?" Before Richard could answer, the front door of the house creaked open, and Evelyn stepped out onto the porch, likely drawn by the sound of an unfamiliar carriage. The moment her eyes landed on Richard Blackwood, every trace of color drained from her face. Her hand flew instinctively to the small key she wore on a chain around her neck, the key to the wooden chest, and her entire body went rigid with a fear Nathan had never seen in her before. Richard's smile widened into something colder, sharper. "Evelyn," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "After all these years, you finally stopped running." Nathan's blood turned cold as he looked between the two of them, realizing in that instant that the past Evelyn had spent so long trying to escape had just arrived uninvited at his front door. "You two know each other?" Nathan asked, his voice low and dangerous. Richard turned back to Nathan, his smile never faltering. "Mr. Walker," he said calmly, "I believe your lovely wife and I have a great deal to discuss." Evelyn's voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. "Nathan," she said, her hands trembling. "Please, don't listen to anything he says." Richard chuckled softly, the sound sending a chill down Nathan's spine. Now, Evelyn," Richard said smoothly. "There's no need for dramatics. I've simply come to discuss business, the kind of business that could make your husband a very wealthy man." Nathan's jaw clenched. "I don't care about wealth," Nathan said firmly. "I care about knowing why my wife looks like she's seen a ghost." Richard's eyes gleamed with something calculating, something dangerous. "Oh, Mr. Walker," he said softly, "I assure you, this ghost is very real, and she's about to change your life forever, one way or another." The air on the porch grew thick with tension, the calm rhythm of ranch life shattered in an instant by the arrival of a man whose smile hid something far darker than politeness. Evelyn stood frozen, her fingers wrapped tightly around the key at her neck, her eyes locked on the man who had once tried to own everything she was. And Nathan, standing between them, felt the sudden, overwhelming certainty that whatever happened next would determine not just the future of his marriage, but the future of the woman who had finally started to feel safe in his home. Richard Blackwood did not leave. He simply stood there on the porch, hat in hand, letting the silence stretch until it became its own kind of weapon. Evelyn's fingers were still locked around the key at her throat, and Nathan could see the tremor running through her hand, even from several feet away. "You've got some nerve," Nathan said, stepping between Richard and the porch steps, showing up at a man's home uninvited. "I sent word ahead," Richard said smoothly. "Through the telegraph office in town. Perhaps your wife failed to mention it." Evelyn's head snapped up. "I never received any telegraph." "No," Richard said, his smile never wavering. "I imagine you wouldn't have opened it if you had." Nathan turned to look at Evelyn, and what he saw in her face wasn't anger. It was terror, buried under years of practiced composure, cracking open right there in front of him. "Evelyn," Nathan said quietly. "Go inside." "Nathan." "Please," he said, not taking his eyes off Richard. "Let me handle this." For a moment, Evelyn didn't move. Every instinct in her body told her that leaving Nathan alone with Richard Blackwood was a mistake, that men like Richard twisted words the way other men twisted rope, tightening them until they choked whoever stood in their way. But something in Nathan's voice, steady, unshaken, made her step back toward the door. She didn't go inside, though. She stood just behind the threshold, close enough to hear every word, her hand pressed flat against the doorframe, like she needed something solid to keep her upright. Richard watched her retreat with an expression of quiet amusement, as if he had expected nothing less. "She's always been like that," he said conversationally, turning back to Nathan. "Skittish, suspicious. I suppose that's understandable given what she's carrying." "What she's carrying is none of your business," Nathan said. "On the contrary, Mr. Walker." Richard's voice hardened just slightly, the polish cracking to reveal something colder underneath. "It's entirely my business. I invested a great deal of money in that woman's education, her training. Years of resources poured into refining a gift that quite frankly would not exist in its current form without me." "You paid her wages," Nathan said. "That doesn't make you owner of what's in her head." Richard laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Is that what she told you, that I simply paid her wages?" Nathan's jaw tightened. "She hasn't told me anything. She doesn't have to." "Oh, but she does," Richard said, stepping closer, his voice dropping into something almost gentle, almost reasonable, the voice of a man who believed, truly believed, that he was the wronged party in this story. "Because what she's not telling you, Mr. Walker, is that everything she knows, every remedy, every technique, every piece of that miraculous gift your neighbors are so impressed by, came from notebooks she stole from my property before she vanished into the night like a thief." Behind the door, Evelyn's breath caught. "That's a lie," she said, her voice sharper than Nathan had ever heard it. Richard turned toward her, tilting his head. "Is it? Those notebooks belong to my grandfather?" Evelyn said, stepping fully back onto the porch now, her fear momentarily overtaken by fury. "Decades before you ever knew my name. And yet," Richard said calmly, "you used them under my employment in my stables, developing methods that made my horses the most valuable breeding stock in 3 counties. Tell me, Evelyn, when exactly does knowledge stop belonging to the person who discovered it and start belonging to the person who paid for the roof over her head while she used it?" "You didn't pay for the roof," Evelyn snapped. "You paid for a room the size of a closet above your stables and called it generosity." Nathan felt something shift inside him. Not surprise, but confirmation, the final piece of a puzzle locking into place. This wasn't a business dispute. This was a man who had trapped a woman inside a cage built entirely out of debt and dependency and was now furious that she'd found the door. "I think you should leave," Nathan said quietly. Richard's eyes flicked toward him, something calculating passing behind them. "I don't think you understand the position you're in, Mr. Walker," he said. "I'm not here to argue with a rancher about morality. I'm here to make you an extremely generous offer." "I don't want your offer." "You will," Richard said, "once you hear it." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper, holding it out toward Nathan with the casual confidence of a man who had never once been told no and actually believed it. "Take it," Richard said. "Read it. Then decide if your pride is worth more than your ranch." "Tja." Nathan didn't take the paper right away. He looked at it, then at Richard, then back toward Evelyn, standing rigid in the doorway, with her arms wrapped around herself, like she was trying to hold her own body together. "Nathan, don't," she whispered. "Please don't listen to him." But curiosity, or maybe something darker, something that wanted to understand exactly what kind of man they were dealing with, made Nathan reach out and take the folded contract from Richard's hand. He opened it slowly. The numbers on the page made his breath catch. It was more money than Nathan had ever seen written on a single sheet of paper in his entire life. Enough to clear every debt on the ranch twice over. Enough to buy new cattle repair every broken fence hire hands for the next 5 years without worry. All in exchange for one thing. Evelyn's return to Richard's employment, along with the complete surrender of her grandfather's notebooks. Nathan read the terms twice, his hands tightening slightly around the paper before he looked up at Richard with an expression that had gone cold and flat. "You want to buy my wife," he said. "I want to correct an injustice," Richard said smoothly. "She left before fulfilling her contract. I'm simply offering fair compensation for the inconvenience her departure caused me and rewarding you generously for helping resolve it." "She's not a horse you can trade," Nathan said. "She's not livestock." "No," Richard agreed. "She's considerably more valuable." Evelyn made a small sound from the doorway, something between a gasp and a sob, and Nathan felt his resolve harden into something unshakable. He looked down at the paper one more time. Then slowly, deliberately, he tore it in half. Richard's smile finally disappeared. "You have no idea what you just did," Richard said quietly, all pretense of friendliness gone from his voice. "I know exactly what I did," Nathan said, letting the torn pieces fall to the porch floor. "I told a man who thinks he owns people that he doesn't own anything on this ranch. Not the land, not the horses, and certainly not my wife." Richard's eyes moved past Nathan to Evelyn, and something in his expression shifted into something far more dangerous than anger, something patient, something calculating. "You always did have a talent for making people care about you," Richard said to her. "Even people who barely know you." "Get off my property," Nathan said. Richard straightened his coat unbothered, as if the torn contract on the ground meant nothing more than a minor delay. "I'll be in town for a few days," he said. "Staying at the hotel should either of you reconsider." He paused, his eyes settling on Evelyn one final time. "This isn't over, Evelyn. It never has been. You should know that by now." He turned, climbed back into his carriage without another word, and rode off down the long dirt road, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the air behind him, like an unspoken threat. Evelyn didn't move until the carriage had disappeared entirely from view. Then her legs seemed to give out beneath her, and she sank down onto the porch steps, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Nathan was at her side in an instant. "Evelyn?" "You shouldn't have torn it," she whispered. "Nathan, that money could have saved this ranch." "This ranch isn't worth anything if it costs me you," Nathan said firmly. Evelyn looked up at him, tears finally breaking free down her cheeks. "You don't understand what he's capable of. Richard doesn't lose. He's never lost anything in his life, and he's not going to start with me." "Then we'll make sure he does," Nathan said. But even as he said the words, a knot of unease settled deep in his stomach because he had seen something in Richard Blackwood's eyes as he climbed back into that carriage. Something patient, something certain. The look of a man who had already planned his next move. That night, Evelyn finally told Nathan everything. They sat together at the kitchen table, a single lamp casting warm light across the worn wood. And for the first time since arriving in Silver Creek, Evelyn let the walls she'd built over years come down completely. "My grandfather raised me," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "My parents died when I was young fever, the kind that swept through our county and took half the children with it. He was all I had left." Nathan listened without interrupting, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. "He wasn't a wealthy man," Evelyn continued, "but he had something money couldn't buy. A way of understanding animals that most people spend their whole lives never learning. He used to say that animals speak constantly through their eyes, their posture, the way they hold their weight. Most people are just too loud, too impatient, too busy to listen." "And he taught you," Nathan said. "Everything," Evelyn said, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "Every evening after chores, we'd sit together, and he'd tell me what he'd learned that day. Eventually, he started writing it all down. Symptoms, remedies, patterns he noticed across years of observation. By the time I was 17, I understood animals better than most veterinarians twice my age." "So what happened?" Nathan asked gently. How did you end up working for a man like Richard Blackwood? Evelyn's expression darkened. My grandfather got sick, she said. The kind of sick that required medicine we couldn't afford. Richard came through our county looking for someone to manage his horse operation. He'd heard rumors about a girl with an unusual gift. He offered me a position, room board, and enough wages to pay for my grandfather's treatment. And you took it. I didn't have a choice, Evelyn said. My grandfather was dying, Nathan. I would have done anything. What happened after? Evelyn's hands tightened around her own cup of coffee. My grandfather passed away 6 months after I started working for Richard, she said quietly. By then, Richard had already seen enough of what I could do to understand its value. He started expanding his operation, using my methods to breed and train horses worth small fortunes. And slowly, the arrangement stopped feeling like employment. What did it feel like? Ownership, Evelyn said simply. He controlled where I lived, who I spoke to. He read every letter I sent and received. He told his business partners I was his greatest asset, like I was a piece of property instead of a person. And when I finally tried to leave, he threatened to have me arrested for theft, claiming the notebooks, my grandfather's notebooks, were company property because I'd used them while working for him. Nathan's jaw tightened with anger. So you ran. In the middle of the night, Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. With nothing but that chest and the clothes on my back, I've been running ever since, changing my name, moving from town to town, never staying anywhere long enough for anyone to notice what I could do, because the moment people noticed, word would spread, and word always found its way back to Richard eventually. Until now, Nathan said quietly. Evelyn met his eyes, tears glistening in the lamplight. Until now. Nathan reached across the table and took her trembling hands in his. You're not going anywhere, he said firmly. Not because of him. Nathan, you don't understand what he's willing to do. I understand enough, Nathan interrupted. I understand that a man like that doesn't see people. He sees profit. And I understand that you've spent years being afraid of someone who never deserved an ounce of the power he held over you. Evelyn's breath caught a small broken sound escaping her lips. I'm tired of running, she admitted, the words seeming to surprise even herself as she said them. Then don't, Nathan said. Not this time. For a long moment, they simply sat together in the quiet kitchen, her hands wrapped in his, the weight of years finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. But outside in the darkness beyond the ranch, the lights of Silver Creek's only hotel burned steadily into the night, and inside one of its rooms, Richard Blackwood sat at a desk writing letters to men whose names carried far more weight and danger than his own. The following morning brought trouble in a form neither Nathan nor Evelyn expected. It started with whispers. Mrs. Colby from the general store mentioned rather too casually that a very well-dressed gentleman from the East had been asking questions around town about the Walker Ranch. By midday, the local blacksmith repeated a rumor he'd heard that Evelyn's gift wasn't a gift at all, but something she'd stolen, that she was in fact wanted for theft back east, and that the handsome businessman in town was simply trying to recover what was rightfully his. By the time Nathan rode into Silver Creek that afternoon to pick up supplies, the whispers had grown into something far uglier. Heard your wife's got quite the history, Samuel Briggs said, carefully catching Nathan outside the feed store. He didn't say it with malice. Samuel had, after all, watched Evelyn save his calf's life with his own eyes, but the concern in his voice was evident. Fella's been telling folks she stole from him, some private notebooks, says she's not who she claims to be. Nathan's hands tightened around the reins of his horse. And you believe that? I don't know what to believe, Samuel admitted. But you know how folks talk. Once a rumor starts, it doesn't much matter if it's true. Nathan clenched his jaw, fury building steadily in his chest. Richard wasn't attacking Evelyn with weapons or lawsuits. He was attacking her reputation, the one thing she had worked years to rebuild in a town that had until now embraced her without question. By the time Nathan returned home, he found Evelyn standing in the yard, pale and shaking, having just returned from delivering medicine to a neighboring farm. They know, she said before he could even dismount his horse. Nathan, they know. People were looking at me different in town, whispering. I heard, Nathan said grimly. Richard's spreading lies. They're not entirely lies, Evelyn said, her voice breaking. I did leave in the middle of the night. I did take the notebooks without his permission, technically. He's twisting the truth just enough that people will believe him. The notebooks were never his, Nathan said firmly. They were your grandfather's. That's not theft. That's survival. Try explaining that to people who've already made up their minds, Evelyn said bitterly. Nathan stepped closer, taking her hands. We'll explain it to whoever needs to hear it. Together. Evelyn shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. You don't understand how this works, Nathan. Rumors don't need truth to survive. They just need enough doubt to make people afraid of standing beside someone. Then we give them the truth loud enough that doubt doesn't have room to breathe, Nathan said. But even as he said it, he could see the fear returning to Evelyn's eyes, the same fear that had gripped her the moment she stepped off that stagecoach weeks ago. The fear of a woman who had spent her entire life being punished for the very thing that made her extraordinary. 2 days later, the situation grew worse. A letter arrived at the ranch, delivered by a nervous young boy who refused to meet Nathan's eyes as he handed it over and rode away as quickly as his horse would carry him. Nathan opened it in the kitchen, Evelyn watching anxiously from across the table. His face darkened as he read. What is it? Evelyn asked. It's from the county sheriff's office, Nathan said slowly. Richards filed a formal complaint. He's claiming theft of private property, the notebooks, and he's requesting an official investigation. Evelyn's face went white. He can't be serious. He's serious, Nathan said grimly. There's going to be a hearing. 2 weeks from now at the county courthouse in Bannock Falls. A hearing. Evelyn repeated, her voice hollow. Nathan, if this goes to a judge, if Richard brings his lawyers, his money, his connections, we'll bring the truth, Nathan said firmly, though even he could hear the uncertainty creeping into his own voice. Evelyn stood up abruptly, pacing the kitchen floor, her hands twisting together anxiously. I don't have proof my grandfather owned those notebooks before Richard employed me, she said. I don't have paperwork. I don't have witnesses. All I have is my word against a wealthy businessman with lawyers and connections throughout 3 states. You have me, Nathan said. You have this town, the people whose animals you've saved, whose trust you've earned. Will that be enough? Evelyn whispered. Nathan didn't have an answer for that, and the silence between them stretched long and heavy, filled with a fear neither of them wanted to speak aloud. Word of the impending hearing spread through Silver Creek almost as quickly as Richard's earlier rumors had, and the town found itself unexpectedly divided. Some residents, remembering the animals Evelyn had saved, the exhaustive hours she'd spent helping neighbors without ever asking for payment, rallied firmly to her defense. Others, swayed by Richard's carefully constructed narrative and his expensive persuasive charm, began to whisper that perhaps there was more to the story than the quiet, mysterious bride wanted anyone to know. Samuel Briggs, to his credit, was among the first to publicly stand beside Evelyn. That woman saved my calf when every other option had failed, he told anyone who would listen. I don't care what fancy paperwork some Eastern businessman waves around. I know character when I see it, and I know a liar when I hear one. But not everyone shared Samuel's conviction, and Nathan watched with growing dread as Richard Blackwood moved through Silver Creek like a slow, patient poison, planting doubt in every conversation, every handshake, every carefully timed rumor. One evening, less than a week before the scheduled hearing, Nathan found Evelyn sitting alone in the barn, next to the old mare she had healed weeks earlier, her face buried in her hands. Evelyn. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen from crying. I keep thinking maybe I should just leave, she said quietly. Disappear again like I always do. Save you from all of this. No, Nathan said firmly, kneeling in front of her. Absolutely not. Nathan, if I stay, if this hearing happens and Richard wins, he won't win. You don't know that, Evelyn said, her voice cracking. And even if we somehow prove the notebooks are mine, the damage is already done. People are already looking at me differently. The trust I built here, the home I finally found, is still here." Nathan interrupted. "Look at me, Evelyn." She lifted her tear-filled eyes to meet his. "You've spent your whole life letting one man's greed convince you that your worth depends on what you can give people," Nathan said. "Your gift, your knowledge, your silence. But your worth was never about what you could give anyone. It's about who you are, patient, brilliant, kind, even after everything that's been taken from you." Evelyn's breath caught tears spilling freely down her cheeks. "I'm scared." She admitted the words raw and honest. "I know," Nathan said, gently pulling her into his arms. "But you don't have to be brave alone anymore." For a long moment, they simply held each other in the quiet barn, the old mare shifting gently beside them, and Evelyn allowed herself for the first time in years to lean fully into the strength of someone who had chosen to stand beside her rather than profit from her. But even as the warmth of that embrace settled over her, a distant nagging fear remained. Because 2 days later, that fear proved justified in a way neither of them could have predicted. It began with a visit from the county sheriff himself, a stern, weathered man named Elias Cobb, who arrived at the ranch unannounced, his expression grim as he dismounted his horse. "Mrs. Walker," he said, addressing Evelyn directly, "I need to ask you some questions regarding the complaint filed against you." "Of course," Evelyn said, her voice tight with anxiety, though she managed to keep her composure. Sheriff Cobb glanced briefly at Nathan before continuing. "Mr. Blackwood has submitted documentation, employment records, financial statements, suggesting a significant business relationship between the two of you spanning nearly 3 years." "That's true," Evelyn admitted. "I worked for him. I never denied that. He's also submitted a signed employment contract," Cobb continued, "which includes a clause stating that any research or methods developed during your employment become property of his operation." Evelyn's face went pale. "I never signed anything like that," she said firmly. Cobb reached into his satchel and withdrew a folded document, handing it to Evelyn. She unfolded it with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the page quickly. At the bottom, in careful, practiced handwriting, was a signature. Her signature. "This is forged," Evelyn said immediately, her voice sharp with disbelief. "I never signed this." "That may be," Cobb said carefully, "but proving forgery requires evidence, Mrs. Walker. And right now, all I have is a signed contract and a formal complaint from a respected businessman." Nathan stepped forward, anger flashing across his face. "Respected? The man's been spreading lies through this entire town for the past 2 weeks." "Be that as it may," Cobb said firmly, "the law requires this matter to be settled properly through the courts. The hearing will proceed as scheduled." He turned back to Evelyn, his expression softening slightly, though his voice remained official. "I'd advise you to find proof of your own, ma'am, because right now on paper, this doesn't look good for you." As Sheriff Cobb rode away, Evelyn stood frozen in the yard, staring down at the forged contract in her hands, her entire body trembling with a fury and fear so intense it left her breathless. "He forged my signature," she whispered. "Nathan, he actually forged my signature." "We'll prove it," Nathan said, though the weight of uncertainty in his own voice was impossible to hide completely. "How?" Evelyn asked, her voice rising with desperation. "How do we prove a signature is forged against a man with enough money to buy every lawyer and expert witness in the territory?" Nathan didn't have an immediate answer, and for the first time since Richard Blackwood's arrival, he felt the true weight of what they were facing. Not just a man determined to reclaim what he believed belonged to him, but a man willing to fabricate evidence, manipulate the law, and destroy a woman's reputation entirely simply because she had dared to walk away from him. That night, as Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, studying the forged contract for the 100th time, searching desperately for some detail, some flaw that might prove its falseness, Nathan noticed something. "Evelyn," he said slowly, "look at the date." She glanced up. "What about it?" "You said you left his employment 3 years ago, correct, before ever arriving in Montana?" "Yes, This contract is dated 8 months ago. Nathan said, his eyes narrowing. Nearly 2 years after you left. Evelyn's breath caught as she stared down at the date, her mind racing. That means, she said slowly, he created this after I'd already disappeared. Which means he doesn't actually have proof you signed anything. Nathan finished, a spark of hope flickering to life in his chest for the first time in days. He fabricated this entire contract after the fact, hoping nobody would look closely enough to notice the timeline doesn't match. Evelyn looked up at him, something between disbelief and cautious hope crossing her tear-streaked face. If we can prove that discrepancy, she said slowly, if we can show the court the dates don't align with the truth, then his entire case falls apart, Nathan said firmly. For the first time since Richard Blackwood's carriage had rolled up their driveway, Evelyn allowed herself a small, fragile flicker of hope. But hope, she knew from painful experience, was a dangerous thing to hold on to around a man who had never once in his entire life accepted defeat gracefully. And somewhere in Silver Creek's only hotel, Richard Blackwood was already crafting his next move. One final devastating card he intended to play the moment Evelyn Harper dared to believe she might actually win. The next morning brought a visitor neither of them expected. A young woman, perhaps 19 or 20, stepped down from a mail coach in Silver Creek and asked directions to the Walker Ranch with a nervousness that made the depot clerk study her twice before answering. By the time she arrived at Nathan's front gate, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely knock. Evelyn opened the door and froze. "Margaret." The young woman's eyes filled with tears. "Evelyn, I've been trying to find you for months." Nathan stepped up behind Evelyn, watching the exchange with cautious curiosity. "You know her. She worked in Richard's household," Evelyn said slowly, disbelief written across her face. "She was barely more than a girl when I left." "I'm not a girl anymore," Margaret said, a flash of steel entering her voice, despite the tremor still running through her hands. "And I couldn't stay silent once I heard what he was doing to you." Evelyn pulled her inside quickly, glancing toward the road, as if Richard himself might materialize out of the dust. "What do you mean, what he's doing to me?" Evelyn asked once the door was closed. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, twisting her hands together. "I still work for Mr. Blackwood, cleaning mostly now that you're gone. 2 weeks ago I overheard him talking with a man in his study, a man who does his less official business. Richard was discussing a contract. Your contract." Nathan's jaw tightened. "The forged one." Margaret's eyes widened. "You know about it." "We know it exists," Evelyn said. "We don't have proof it's false, not proof a judge would accept." Margaret reached into the small bag she carried and withdrew a folded piece of paper, her hands trembling as she pushed it across the table. "I copied down what I heard," she said. "Word for word as best I could remember. Richard told the man his name is Sawyer. I believe some kind of forger who does work for wealthy men who don't want to be caught doing dishonest things. He told Sawyer the signature needed to look aged, weathered. He said, and I remember this, exactly he said, make it look like it's been sitting in a drawer for 2 years, not 2 months. Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth. "That's exactly what the contract looks like," she whispered. "Aged paper, faded ink. I noticed it and thought nothing of it because I assumed—" "You assumed because everything about it looked convincing," Nathan finished grimly. "That's what makes it dangerous." "Will you testify to this?" Nathan asked Margaret directly. "In front of the judge in Bannock Falls." Margaret's face went pale, but she nodded slowly. "I know what it will cost me. Richard will fire me the moment he learns I've spoken. He might do worse than that. But I watched him break that woman's spirit for 3 years, and I won't watch him do it again from the safety of silence." Evelyn reached across the table and took Margaret's hand, tears slipping freely down her face. "You don't know what this means." "I know exactly what it means," Margaret said softly. "It means someone finally stands a chance against him." But hope, as Evelyn had learned through years of hard experience, rarely arrived without a price attached. 2 days after Margaret's visit, Nathan rode into Silver Creek to send a telegram to the county courthouse, requesting Margaret be added to the witness list for the upcoming hearing. He returned home just before sundown, his face tight with barely restrained fury. "What happened?" Evelyn asked immediately, reading the tension in his shoulders. "Richard's been busy," Nathan said grimly, tossing his hat onto the table. "He's hired a lawyer out of Helena. Man's got a reputation for winning cases through intimidation rather than evidence." "What kind of intimidation?" Nathan hesitated, clearly reluctant to share the rest. "Nathan. He's been asking around town about our finances," Nathan admitted finally. "Whether we've got debts, whether the bank holds any notes against this land." Evelyn's stomach dropped. "Why would that matter?" "Because if he can prove we're desperate for money," Nathan said quietly, "he can argue in court that you have motive to lie. That we conspired together, you and I, to invent a story about theft and forgery specifically to avoid honoring a legitimate contract because we needed the money that badly." "That's absurd," Evelyn said, though her voice wavered with fear. "It's absurd," Nathan agreed. "But absurd things convince judges every day when they're delivered by expensive lawyers in expensive suits." Evelyn sank into a chair, her hands pressed against her temples. "Every step forward, he finds another way to pull us back. Then we take 2 steps forward for every one he pulls back," Nathan said firmly, though even he could hear the strain beneath his own resolve. That night, neither of them slept well. Nathan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, running through every possible argument Richard's lawyer might raise, every possible weakness in their case. Evelyn, in the room beside his, sat on the edge of her bed, with the wooden chest open in front of her, for the first time in weeks, carefully paging through her grandfather's notebooks, searching for anything, any date, any note, any scrap of evidence that might prove definitively when the knowledge inside truly began. Near midnight, she found it. A small entry tucked into the margin of one of the oldest notebooks, dated nearly 6 years before she'd ever set foot on Richard Blackwood's property. Her grandfather's handwriting, shaky even then with the early tremors of the illness that would eventually take his life, described in detail a treatment for equine colic, the very same treatment Evelyn had used to save Samuel Briggs's calf months earlier. Her hands trembled as she carried the notebook down the hall and knocked on Nathan's door. He opened it immediately, clearly still awake. "Look," she said, holding out the notebook, her voice shaking with something between disbelief and hope. 6 years before Richard even knew my name. This proves the knowledge existed before I ever worked for him." Nathan studied the entry carefully, his expression slowly shifting from exhaustion to something sharper, more alert. "This is dated and signed by your grandfather," he said. "Yes. Do you have others like this, entries with clear dates, clear enough to establish a timeline?" Evelyn nodded slowly. "Dozens. Maybe more. I never thought to look at them this way. Before I was always just trying to preserve his memory, not build a legal case." Nathan's eyes lit with something Evelyn hadn't seen in days, genuine hope. "Then that's exactly what we're going to do," he said. "We're going to go through every single page of that chest, and we're going to build a timeline so undeniable that no lawyer in Montana can argue against it." For the next several days, the kitchen table became a battlefield of a different kind, one waged not with weapons, but with ink paper and painstaking documentation. Evelyn worked late into each night, carefully cataloging every dated entry in her grandfather's notebooks, cross-referencing years, cross-referencing techniques, building an undeniable record, proving that the knowledge Richard claimed as his own property had existed years before Evelyn ever crossed his threshold. Nathan, meanwhile, rode across the county gathering support. Samuel Briggs agreed immediately to testify about the calf Evelyn had saved and the timeline of when that treatment had first appeared in her grandfather's writings. 3 more ranchers, all of whom Evelyn had helped without ever requesting payment, agreed to speak on her behalf as well, their gratitude outweighing any hesitation about becoming entangled in a legal dispute with a wealthy Eastern businessman. But even as their case strengthened, Richard was not idle. A week before the hearing, disturbing news reached the ranch through Samuel, whose cousin worked at the telegraph office in Bannock Falls. Richard's lawyer has been requesting information about you, specifically Nathan. Samuel said, his weathered face creased with concern. Your finances, your family history, even inquiries about your first wife. Nathan went rigid. My first wife has nothing to do with this. I know that, Samuel said gently. But if they're digging that deep, they're looking for something to use against you personally. Something to make the judge doubt your character, not just Evelyn's. That evening, Nathan sat at the kitchen table, uncharacteristically quiet, staring down at his hands. Nathan, Evelyn asked carefully. What is it? He was silent for a long moment before finally speaking. My first wife died 3 years ago, he said quietly. Fever same as took your parents. We were married 5 years, and we never had children. Something the doctors could never fully explain, though everyone in town had their theories, most of them unkind toward her. Nathan, you don't have to. I want you to hear it from me, he said, before you hear some twisted version of it from Richard's lawyer in that courtroom. After she passed, I was alone for 2 years before I wrote that advertisement for a bride. Some folks in town whispered that I drove her to an early grave with how hard I worked her on this ranch. It wasn't true, but grief makes people look for someone to blame, and I was the easiest target available. Evelyn reached across the table and took his hand firmly. I don't need to hear a twisted version, she said. I know exactly who you are, Nathan Walker. A man who tore up a fortune rather than sell out the woman standing beside him. That's all the character reference I'll ever need. Nathan's throat tightened with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. Whatever they say about either of us in that courtroom, he said, I need you to know it doesn't change what's true between us. Nothing could, Evelyn whispered. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and gray, a fitting mirror for the tension gripping both of them as they climbed into the wagon and made the long journey to Bannock Falls. The courthouse was already crowded by the time they arrived, word of the dispute having spread far beyond Silver Creek's borders. Curious onlookers packed the wooden benches, eager to witness the spectacle of a wealthy Eastern businessman accusing a rancher's new bride of theft and fraud. Richard sat at the opposing table, impeccably dressed, his expensive lawyer beside him, shuffling through papers with practiced confidence. When Evelyn entered, Richard's eyes found hers immediately, and his lips curved into a small, knowing smile that made her stomach twist with dread. Judge Harmon Whitfield, a stern man in his 60s with decades of frontier justice behind his weathered eyes, called the proceedings to order with a single sharp rap of his gavel. Richard's lawyer rose first, presenting the forged contract with theatrical confidence, walking the judge through Richard's version of events. A loyal employee who had absconded with valuable proprietary research fleeing in the night to avoid honoring a legitimate business agreement. The defendant, the lawyer said smoothly, gesturing toward Evelyn, took advantage of my client's generosity and investment only to abandon her obligations the moment a more convenient arrangement presented itself in the form of marriage to a local rancher. Evelyn's hands clenched beneath the table, but Nathan's steady presence beside her kept her grounded. When it was their turn to respond, Nathan's hired attorney, a quieter, less flashy man named Wilcox, but sharp as a blade beneath his modest appearance, rose calmly. Your Honor, Wilcox began, I'd like to draw the court's attention to a rather significant detail regarding the timeline presented in this so-called contract. He proceeded to lay out methodically and without theatrics the discrepancy between the contract's claimed signing date and Evelyn's documented departure from Richard's employment years earlier. Richard's lawyer objected immediately, but Judge Whitfield allowed the argument to continue, his sharp eyes narrowing with genuine interest. Then Wilcox called his first witness, Margaret. The young woman's testimony, delivered in a trembling but determined voice, detailed the conversation she'd overheard between Richard and the forger named Sawyer, describing in painful specific detail how the contract had been deliberately aged to appear years older than its actual creation. Richard's composure, for the first time since the hearing began, showed the faintest crack. His lawyer attempted to discredit Margaret's testimony, painting her as a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge, But Wilcox calmly produced Margaret's employment records, proving she had in fact remained employed by Richard until the very week she'd traveled to warn Evelyn, hardly the actions of someone motivated by petty grievance. Then came the notebooks. One by one, Wilcox presented dated entries from Evelyn's grandfather's writings, methodically establishing a timeline stretching back years before Richard Blackwood had ever entered her life. Samuel Briggs took the stand, describing in detail the treatment Evelyn had used to save his calf. A treatment documented in her grandfather's notes years before Richard's contract claimed the knowledge had been developed under his employment. The courtroom, initially skeptical, began shifting visibly in mood as witness after witness corroborated the timeline, painting a clear and undeniable picture of a young woman whose gift had existed long before any wealthy businessman had attempted to claim ownership of it. Richard's lawyer, sensing the tide turning, attempted one final desperate maneuver. "Your Honor," he said, rising abruptly, "I'd like to submit additional evidence regarding the defendant's husband, Nathan Walker, and the mysterious circumstances surrounding his first wife's death." The courtroom fell utterly silent. Nathan's hands clenched beneath the table, his jaw tightening with barely controlled fury, but he forced himself to remain still, remembering his own words to Evelyn just days before that whatever anyone said in this courtroom couldn't change what was true between them. Judge Whitfield's expression darkened immediately. "Counselor, unless this so-called evidence pertains directly to the matter at hand, the alleged theft and forged contract, I suggest you refrain from wasting this court's time with baseless character attacks." Richard's lawyer hesitated clearly, having expected the tactic to derail proceedings more effectively. "Your Honor, I simply believe the court should understand the full context of the defendant's laws." "The context I understand perfectly well, Counselor," Judge Whitfield interrupted sharply, "is that your client has presented this court with a forged document supported by testimony from a witness who directly overheard its fabrication, while the defense has presented consistent, well-documented evidence establishing a timeline. Your client's claims simply cannot survive." Richard's face, for the first time since arriving in Montana, showed genuine alarm. "Your Honor," he said, rising from his seat, his composed mask finally slipping entirely, "I assure you this entire proceeding has been manipulated by a woman skilled at manufacturing sympathy." "Sit down, Mr. Blackwood," Judge Whitfield said sharply, "before I hold you in contempt." Richard sank back into his chair, his face pale with an emotion Evelyn had never once seen on him in 3 years of employment. Fear. Judge Whitfield studied the assembled evidence for a long moment, the courtroom holding its collective breath before finally speaking. "Based on the evidence presented," he said slowly, "this court finds significant and troubling irregularities regarding the authenticity of the contract submitted by the plaintiff. Furthermore, testimony provided under oath directly implicates the plaintiff in the deliberate fabrication of legal documents, a matter this court considers serious enough to warrant separate criminal investigation." Evelyn's breath caught hope rising dangerously in her chest. "Therefore," Judge Whitfield continued, "this court dismisses the plaintiff's claim against the defendant, Evelyn Walker, in its entirety, and refers the matter of contract fabrication to the county prosecutor for further investigation." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom. Evelyn sat frozen for a moment, disbelief washing over her in waves before Nathan's arms wrapped around her, pulling her into an embrace filled with 3 years of fear, finally beginning to release. "It's over," he whispered against her hair. "Evelyn, it's over." But as she looked past Nathan's shoulder toward the opposing table, she saw Richard Blackwood staring at her with an expression that told her with chilling certainty that a man who had never once accepted defeat in his entire life had no intention of accepting it now either. His eyes locked with hers one final time before he stood, straightened his coat with trembling hands, and stormed out of the courtroom without another word. But it wasn't the fury in his expression that frightened Evelyn most. It was the calm, calculating stillness that settled over his face just before he disappeared through the courthouse doors, the look of a man already planning something far more dangerous than a courtroom battle. The ride home from Bannock Falls should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like the quiet before a storm neither of them could name yet. Evelyn sat close to Nathan on the wagon bench, her hands finally still after hours of trembling, but her eyes kept drifting back toward the road behind them, half expecting to see Richard's carriage trailing in the distance. "He's not following us," Nathan said quietly, noticing where her attention kept wandering. "Not today," Evelyn said. "But men like Richard don't disappear just because a judge told them no." "The judge did more than tell him no," Nathan reminded her. "He's referring the forgery to the county prosecutor. Richard could be facing real charges." "Which makes him more dangerous," Evelyn said, "not less." Nathan glanced at her, unable to argue with the logic, even though he wanted to. A cornered man with money and pride was rarely a safer man. He was simply a man with fewer options left to lose gracefully. They arrived back at the ranch as the sun dipped low, painting the fields in soft amber light, and for a few precious hours they allowed themselves to simply breathe. Samuel Briggs rode out that evening with a jug of cider, and a grin stretched wide across his weathered face, insisting on celebrating the victory properly. "Judge Whitfield doesn't hand out rulings like that without being certain," Samuel said, raising his cup. "That businessman's finished in this territory. Word will spread fast." "Word travels both directions," Nathan said, though he kept his voice light for Evelyn's sake. "Let's just hope it travels the direction we want." That night, for the first time in weeks, Evelyn slept without waking in a cold sweat, without her hand instinctively reaching for the key around her neck. Nathan noticed the change immediately the next morning, a softness in her shoulders, an ease in the way she moved through the kitchen, humming quietly to herself as she prepared breakfast. "You look different," he said, watching her from the doorway. "I feel different," she admitted, smiling for what felt like the first time in years without any weight behind it. "Like I can finally exhale." Nathan crossed the kitchen and kissed her forehead gently. "Don't get too comfortable," he teased softly. "Old Bessie's been favoring that same leg again. I think she missed her doctor." Evelyn laughed a real laugh, bright and unguarded, and for a moment the ranch felt exactly like the home she had never believed she'd be allowed to have. But peace, as Evelyn had learned through painful experience, rarely lasted longer than it took trouble to find its next opening. 3 days after the hearing, a rider arrived at the ranch just past noon, his horse lathered with sweat, his face grim with urgency. "Mrs. Walker," he said, barely dismounting before speaking. "Sheriff Cobb sent me. Says you need to come to town immediately." Evelyn's stomach dropped. "What's happened?" "It's Margaret," the rider said. "The girl who testified against Blackwood. Someone attacked her outside her boarding house last night." Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth, horror flooding through her. "Is she?" "She's alive," the rider said quickly. "Beaten badly, but alive. Doctor says she'll recover, but she's asking for you." Nathan was already moving toward the barn before the rider finished speaking, saddling horses with quick, practiced hands, while Evelyn stood frozen in place, guilt and fear warring inside her chest. "This is because of me," she whispered as Nathan led her horse toward her. "She warned me and now she's paying for it." "This is because of Richard," Nathan corrected firmly, helping her mount. "Don't you dare carry guilt that belongs entirely to him." They rode into Silver Creek faster than Evelyn had ever ridden in her life, arriving at the small boarding house to find Sheriff Cobb standing outside, his expression carved from stone. "Two men," he said without preamble as they dismounted. "Witnesses say they wore dark coats, kept their faces covered. Professional by the sound of it. Not local trouble." "Richard hired them," Nathan said, his voice tight with barely restrained fury. "I can't prove that," Cobb said carefully. "Not yet, but I'd be a fool not to suspect it." Inside, Margaret lay in a narrow bed, her face bruised and swollen, one arm wrapped tightly in bandages. When she saw Evelyn enter, tears welled instantly in her eyes. "Evelyn," she whispered, her voice hoarse with pain. "I'm here," Evelyn said, rushing to her side, taking her uninjured hand gently. "I'm so sorry, Margaret. This is—" "Don't," Margaret interrupted weakly. "Don't you dare apologize. I knew the risk when I stepped off that coach. I'd do it again. Did you see who did this? Nathan asked gently. Margaret shook her head slightly, wincing at the movement. They didn't speak much, but one of them said something right before they left. Said, "Tell your friend this is just a warning. Mr. Blackwood doesn't forget." Evelyn's blood ran cold. "He's not finished," she whispered. "No," Sheriff Cobb said grimly from the doorway. "I don't believe he is." The attack on Margaret changed everything. What had felt for 3 brief days like a battle won now felt like the opening move of something far more dangerous. Nathan doubled the ranch hands standing watch each night. Sheriff Cobb assigned a deputy to check on the property regularly, though everyone involved understood the limitations of frontier law enforcement against a man with Richard's resources. Evelyn, for her part, refused to hide. "I spent years running from him," she told Nathan firmly one evening, as they sat together reviewing letters from the county prosecutor's office regarding the forgery investigation. "I won't spend the rest of my life hiding from him, too." "Nobody's asking you to hide," Nathan said. "But we need to be smart about this, Evelyn. Richard's already shown he's willing to hurt people who stand against him. Then we make sure standing against him costs him more than he's willing to pay," Evelyn said. Her opportunity came sooner than either of them expected. A letter arrived from the County Agricultural Board addressed specifically to Evelyn, inviting her to demonstrate her methods at the annual Territorial Horse Exhibition in Bannock Falls, an event drawing ranchers, breeders, and buyers from across 3 counties, along with notably several newspaper correspondents covering agricultural developments throughout the territory. "This is exactly what we need," Nathan said, reading the letter over her shoulder. "A public demonstration, hundreds of witnesses. If Richard's still spreading rumors about your credibility, then I prove them wrong in front of everyone who matters." Evelyn finished, determination hardening in her voice. But even as hope flickered back to life, a familiar unease settled over her. "Richard will be there," she said quietly. "Or someone working for him will be." "Probably," Nathan agreed. "Which means whatever happens, it happens in front of enough witnesses that he can't hide behind forged paperwork or hired thugs." Evelyn studied the letter for a long moment before finally nodding. "All right," she said. "Let's do it." The weeks leading up to the exhibition passed in a blur of preparation. Evelyn spent hours each day studying her grandfather's notebooks with renewed purpose, refining her understanding, preparing herself for the possibility of working under intense public scrutiny rather than the quiet privacy of a familiar barn. Nathan, meanwhile, grew increasingly protective, insisting on accompanying her everywhere, watching every stranger who passed through Silver Creek with sharp, suspicious eyes. "You're going to wear yourself thin," Evelyn told him one evening, noticing the dark circles forming beneath his eyes. "I'd rather wear myself thin than lose you," Nathan replied simply. Their bond, forged initially through fear and necessity, had deepened into something neither of them had expected to find on a lonely Montana ranch. A partnership built not on convenience, but on genuine, unshakable trust. Yet even as their relationship strengthened, unsettling news continued trickling in from Bannock Falls. Sheriff Cobb reported that Richard Blackwood had hired an expensive attorney to challenge the forgery investigation, delaying proceedings through endless legal maneuvering. Worse still, whispers began circulating that Richard was quietly buying influence among several prominent ranchers and businessmen scheduled to attend the upcoming exhibition, men whose public opinion could sway the crowd's perception, regardless of whatever demonstration Evelyn planned to give. "He's trying to poison the well before we even get there," Nathan said grimly, reading a letter from Samuel Briggs detailing the rumors. "Then we need something undeniable," Evelyn said. "Something even his money can't argue against." She spent the following days poring over her grandfather's notebooks with renewed intensity, searching for something specific, a particularly difficult case, a demonstration so clear and unmistakable that no amount of doubt or rumor could survive witnessing it firsthand. 3 nights before the exhibition, she found it. "Nathan," she said, waking him gently in the darkness, her voice trembling with excitement. "I think I know what to do." He sat up immediately, alert despite the hour. "What is it?" "My grandfather documented a case," she said, spreading the notebook open before him. "A horse suffering from a condition most ranchers mistake for simple lameness or old age. But it's actually something far more specific, far more dangerous if left untreated. The symptoms are subtle enough that even experienced veterinarians frequently misdiagnose it." "And you think this will happen at the exhibition?" "I think," Evelyn said carefully, "that champion horses pushed hard in competition under stress in unfamiliar environments are exactly the kind of animals likely to show these symptoms. If something like this happens during the exhibition in front of everyone, and I'm the only one who recognizes what's actually wrong, then there's no rumor powerful enough to argue against what people witness with their own eyes." Nathan finished, understanding dawning in his expression. Exactly. But even as hope solidified between them, worry lingered in Nathan's eyes. "And if nothing happens," he asked quietly, "if we're relying on chance to prove your worth?" Evelyn's expression grew resolute. "Then I'll find another way, but I refuse to walk into that exhibition assuming I need luck to prove what I already know is true." The day of the exhibition arrived bright and clear. The fairgrounds outside Bannock Falls packed with more people than Evelyn had seen gathered in one place since arriving in Montana. Wagons lined the roads for nearly a mile, ranchers and breeders from 3 counties mingling amid pens of horses and cattle, the air thick with excitement dust and the sharp scent of hay and livestock. Nathan stayed close by Evelyn's side as they moved through the crowd, his eyes scanning constantly for any sign of Richard Blackwood or the men who had attacked Margaret weeks earlier. "There," Evelyn said quietly, nodding toward a cluster of well-dressed men standing near the main arena. Richard stood among them, dressed impeccably as always, his expression composed and confident, despite the pending forgery investigation hanging over his reputation. When his eyes found Evelyn across the crowd, his lips curved into the same knowing smile that had haunted her for years. "He's not worried," Nathan observed grimly. "That worries me." "He's never worried until it's too late," Evelyn said. "That's exactly why he keeps making mistakes." Throughout the morning, the exhibition proceeded with impressive displays of horsemanship, breeding stock evaluations, and agricultural demonstrations. Evelyn watched carefully, weighting her instincts sharpened by years of quiet observation. It happened just past midday. A commotion erupted near the main arena, where a magnificent chestnut stallion, the pride of a wealthy breeder from Helena, favored heavily to win the exhibition's prestigious championship class, suddenly stumbled mid-stride, collapsing awkwardly onto the packed dirt. The crowd gasped collectively, murmurs of alarm rippling through the gathered spectators. Several veterinarians rushed forward immediately, examining the distressed animal with growing concern. "He's finished," someone nearby muttered. "That horse won't compete again." "Might not survive the day," another voice added grimly. Evelyn's heart pounded as she watched the scene unfold, recognizing immediately the subtle signs described in her grandfather's notebook signs. The panicked veterinarians focused on obvious symptoms of distress were completely missing. "Nathan," she whispered urgently. "That's it. That's exactly the condition I told you about." "Are you certain?" "Completely." Without waiting for further confirmation, Evelyn pushed forward through the crowd, ignoring the surprised protests of onlookers as she approached the stricken animal. "Ma'am, you can't be here," one of the veterinarians said sharply, noticing her sudden approach. "This is a professional matter." "I can help," Evelyn said firmly, kneeling beside the horse despite the veterinarian's objection. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as recognition spread, whispers identifying her as the woman from Richard Blackwood's very public dispute, the accused thief now suddenly inserting herself into the exhibition's most dramatic moment. Richard, watching from the edge of the crowd, allowed a small, satisfied smile to cross his face, clearly anticipating public humiliation rather than triumph. Evelyn ignored them all. She placed her hands gently along the horse's neck and jaw, closing her eyes briefly, focusing entirely on what her grandfather had taught her years earlier: patience, observation, the discipline to notice what panic caused others to overlook. "His pulse is elevated but not erratic," she murmured, mostly to herself. His pupils are dilated evenly. This isn't colic, and it isn't simple exhaustion. Then what is it? The lead veterinarian demanded, equal parts skeptical and desperate. Evelyn's fingers moved carefully along the horse's lower jaw, pressing gently at specific points with practiced precision. "There," she said quietly. "Feel this swelling right beneath the jawline. It's subtle, easy to miss beneath the panic of a collapse like this." The veterinarian examined the area skeptically, then paused, his expression shifting slightly. "There is some swelling here, yes, but it's a blocked salivary gland," Evelyn said firmly. "Combined with the stress of competition and unfamiliar surroundings, it's caused a rare but recognizable reaction, restricted swallowing, leading to sudden collapse from what looks like exhaustion, but isn't." "That's absurd," the veterinarian said dismissively. "I've never encountered such a condition in 20 years of practice." "With respect," Evelyn said calmly, "my grandfather documented 17 cases exactly like this one across nearly 30 years of careful observation. It's rare specifically because most people never look closely enough to recognize it." The crowd around them had grown thick with tension, hundreds of eyes locked on the unfolding confrontation between the desperate skeptical professional and the quiet determined woman kneeling beside a dying animal. "If you're wrong," the veterinarian said sharply, "you could cause irreparable harm." "If I'm right," Evelyn replied evenly, "this horse dies within the hour, regardless of what any of us do, unless someone acts immediately." The tension stretched unbearably before the horse's owner. A desperate older man watching his prize stallion struggle for breath finally stepped forward. "Let her try," he said quietly. "We've got nothing left to lose." Evelyn nodded gratefully, then turned to Nathan, who immediately understood the silent request in her eyes and rushed to retrieve specific tools from their wagon tools Evelyn had prepared carefully the night before, anticipating exactly this kind of emergency. With calm, practiced precision, Evelyn worked quickly locating the blocked gland exactly where she'd predicted, carefully relieving the pressure, using techniques passed down from her grandfather's decades of patient observation. The crowd watched in tense silence. Long moments passed. Then gradually, the stallion's labored breathing began to ease. His eyes, wide with panic moments before, softened slightly. And finally, with visible effort, the great horse lifted his head, then slowly, unsteadily rose back onto his feet. The crowd erupted into stunned applause. The veterinarian, who moments earlier had dismissed Evelyn's diagnosis, stared at her with open astonishment. "How did you—" "Patience," Evelyn said, simply rising to her feet, brushing dust from her skirt. "And a willingness to listen to what everyone else assumed wasn't worth hearing." The stallion's owner rushed forward, tears of relief and gratitude streaming down his weathered face. "You saved him," he said, gripping Evelyn's hands tightly. "You saved my horse's life." "I simply noticed what your veterinarians were too panicked to see," Evelyn said humbly. But the crowd, having witnessed the entire dramatic scene unfold before their own eyes, understood the significance far beyond simple modesty. Whispers rippled rapidly through the gathered spectators, transforming within minutes from skepticism into awe. Newspaper correspondents present specifically to document notable events at the exhibition scrambled forward eagerly, pencils flying across notepads as they captured every detail of the extraordinary demonstration. Richard Blackwood, watching from the edge of the crowd, felt the ground shifting rapidly beneath his carefully constructed narrative. His confident smile had vanished entirely, replaced by something colder, more calculating, more dangerous. He turned abruptly and disappeared into the crowd without a word, but Evelyn, catching sight of his retreating figure, felt no relief, because she knew with chilling certainty that a man who had never once accepted defeat gracefully would not accept this humiliation without one final desperate act of retaliation. That night, exhausted but triumphant, Nathan and Evelyn returned to their hotel room in Bannock Falls, the exhibition's dramatic events still echoing through the town's excited conversations. "You did it," Nathan said, pulling her into a tight embrace the moment their door closed. "Evelyn, you actually did it." "We did it," she corrected softly, relief and exhaustion mingling in her voice. "I couldn't have found the courage to step forward without you beside me." For a moment, they simply held each other. the weight of months of fear and uncertainty finally beginning to lift. But their celebration was interrupted by a sharp, urgent knock at the door. Nathan opened it cautiously to find Sheriff Cobb standing in the hallway, his expression grim. "Mr. Walker," Cobb said without preamble, "we need to talk. It's about Richard Blackwood." "What's happened?" Evelyn asked, stepping forward anxiously. Cobb hesitated clearly, reluctant to share difficult news after such a triumphant day. "The county prosecutor's office received an anonymous tip this evening," he said finally, "regarding Richard's whereabouts and intentions." "What kind of intentions?" Nathan asked sharply. Cobb's expression darkened further. "The tip suggests Richard's planning to leave the territory tonight before formal forgery charges can be filed against him. But that's not the most concerning part." "What is?" Evelyn asked, dread pooling in her stomach. "The tip also suggests," Cobb said carefully, "that Richard doesn't intend to leave quietly, that he's made specific threats regarding retaliation against both of you before his departure." Evelyn's breath caught sharply. "What kind of threats?" Nathan demanded, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. Cobb hesitated only a moment before answering. "The kind that suggests tonight might be the most dangerous night either of you have faced yet." "What kind of threats?" Nathan asked again, his voice dropping to something low and dangerous. Cobb glanced between them before answering. "The tip claims Richard hired the same men who attacked Margaret. Says they've been paid to make sure neither of you can testify further against him and to recover whatever's left of those notebooks before he crosses the territory line." Evelyn's knees nearly buckled. Nathan caught her elbow, steadying her. "When?" Nathan demanded. "Tonight," Cobb said. "My deputies are already riding toward the ranch. I need you both to stay here in town where I can keep watch over you." "The chest is at the ranch," Evelyn said suddenly, panic flooding her voice. "My grandfather's notebooks, everything, it's still there, Nathan." "Then we get ahead of them," Nathan said, already reaching for his coat. "Mr. Walker, I strongly advise against—" "With respect, Sheriff," Nathan said, "I've spent months watching that man try to take everything from my wife. I'm not about to sit in a hotel room and hope your deputies get there first." Cobb studied him for a long moment, then sighed heavily. "Then you ride with my men, not ahead of them. Is that understood?" Nathan nodded once sharp and final. Evelyn grabbed his arm before he could move. "I'm coming with you." "Evelyn, that chest is mine," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear trembling beneath it. "My grandfather's life's work. I won't let it disappear into the dark because I was too afraid to stand beside you." Nathan searched her face for a long moment, seeing not the frightened woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach months earlier, but someone who had finally fully stopped running. "All right," he said quietly. "Together, then." The ride back to the ranch felt endless, the night pressing close and cold around them, every shadow along the road seeming to shift and breathe with hidden threat. Sheriff Cobb rode ahead with two deputies, Nathan and Evelyn close behind their horses' hooves, pounding a frantic rhythm against the packed dirt. They were still a mile out when they saw it. Firelight, flickering against the dark horizon exactly where the ranch house should have stood quiet and unlit. "No," Evelyn gasped, urging her horse faster. "Evelyn, wait," Nathan called, but she was already ahead of him, driven by a fear too large to contain. They crested the final ridge to find two men dragging burning brush away from the side of the barn. Not the house, Nathan realized with a rush of relief, the barn, while a third man emerged from the front door, carrying the wooden chest under one arm. "That's him," Evelyn breathed. "That's Sawyer, the forger." Sheriff Cobb spurred his horse forward with a sharp shout. "Sheriff's office! Stop where you stand!" The men scattered instantly, the one carrying the chest, sprinting toward a waiting horse at the tree line. Nathan didn't think. He simply moved, kicking his horse into a dead run, cutting across the field at an angle that put him directly in the fleeing man's path. "Nathan, don't!" Evelyn screamed. But Nathan had already thrown himself from his horse, tackling Sawyer, just as the man reached his mount, both of them crashing hard into the dirt. The chest flew from Sawyer's grip, tumbling open its precious contents, scattering across the ground. Evelyn was there in an instant, dropping to her knees, gathering the loose pages with desperate, trembling hands, while Nathan wrestled the forger into submission, one knee planted firmly against the man's back. "Get off me," Sawyer snarled. "Not until the sheriff says otherwise." Nathan growled back. Cobb and his deputies arrived moments later, quickly subduing the two remaining men who'd been attempting to set fire to the barn. Within minutes, all three were bound and secured, the immediate danger finally mercifully extinguished. Evelyn sat in the dirt, clutching her grandfather's scattered notebooks against her chest, tears streaming freely down her face. Not from fear this time, but from something closer to disbelief. "They're safe," she whispered. "Nathan, they're all here. Every page." Nathan knelt beside her, breathing hard, a fresh bruise already forming along his jaw, where Sawyer had landed a desperate blow during the struggle. "You're safe," he corrected gently, pulling her into his arms. "That's all that matters." Sawyer, faced with the immediate reality of criminal charges and no loyalty left to protect a man who'd already fled the territory, confessed everything within hours of his arrest. The forged contract, the attack on Margaret and Richard's final desperate plan to destroy the notebooks and silence both witnesses before disappearing entirely. "Blackwood's gone." Cobb told them the next morning, exhaustion evident in his weathered face after a sleepless night processing arrests. "Boarded a train out of Bannock Falls before dawn. My deputies missed him by less than an hour." "He's just going to disappear?" Nathan asked, disbelief and frustration mixing in his voice. "After everything he's done?" "Not entirely," Cobb said. Sawyer's confession, combined with the forgery investigation already underway, gives the prosecutor more than enough to pursue charges, regardless of Richard's location. Word will travel through every territory office between here and the coast. Men like Richard Blackwood rely on reputation and influence to operate freely. Once that's gone, he becomes just another criminal running from the law. Evelyn finished quietly. "Exactly," Cobb said. "It might not feel like justice today, but it's the beginning of it." Evelyn absorbed this slowly, the weight of years finally beginning to loosen its grip on her chest. She had spent so long believing that true justice meant Richard's suffering as completely as she had suffered under his control. But standing there, morning light spilling gently across the ranch that had somehow, despite everything, remained standing and whole, she understood something deeper. Justice wasn't about matching his cruelty. It was about finally being free of it. News of Richard Blackwood's downfall spread through Silver Creek and the surrounding territory faster than any rumor he'd ever managed to spread himself. The newspaper correspondents who'd witnessed Evelyn's dramatic rescue of the champion stallion at the exhibition had already filed their stories, and within days, accounts of the courageous rancher's bride, who'd exposed a wealthy eastern fraudster, appeared in papers as far away as Helena and Bozeman. Margaret, recovering steadily from her injuries, received an outpouring of support from the community, several families offering her employment and shelter, far from any lingering connection to Richard's household. "I don't regret a single moment of it," she told Evelyn during a visit weeks later, her bruises finally beginning to fade. "Watching him lose everything he thought made him powerful, that's worth every bit of pain it cost me." Samuel Briggs, ever practical, simply grinned each time the subject arose. "Told you folks around here know character when they see it," he said. Didn't take long for the truth to outrun his lies. But it was the quiet moments, not the public vindication, that meant the most to Evelyn. The ranch, once merely a place of refuge, slowly transformed into something she had never dared imagine for herself, a true home filled with warmth, laughter, and the steady, unwavering presence of a man who had chosen her fully, and without hesitation, from the very first moment she'd warned him not to touch her wooden chest. One evening, several weeks after Richard's disappearance, Nathan found Evelyn sitting on the porch, her grandfather's notebook spread open across her lap, sunlight fading gently behind the distant hills. "What are you working on?" he asked, settling beside her. "I've been thinking," Evelyn said slowly, "about everything my grandfather taught me. All these years I protected his knowledge like it was something fragile, something that could only survive if I kept it hidden and safe. And now I think he'd want it shared, she said. Not sold, not owned by anyone, but shared freely with anyone willing to learn the same patience he taught me. Nathan studied her carefully. You're thinking of teaching. I'm thinking, Evelyn said, a small, hopeful smile touching her lips, that Silver Creek could use someone willing to teach ranchers how to truly listen to their animals. Not just treat symptoms, but understand causes. Prevent suffering before it happens. That's not a small undertaking, Nathan said. No, Evelyn agreed. But I've spent years running from what makes me different. I'd rather spend the rest of my life using it to help people out in the open, without fear of who might be watching. Nathan reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. Then that's exactly what we'll do, he said firmly. Together. Word of Evelyn's willingness to teach spread quickly, and within a month, ranchers from across the county began arriving at the Walker Ranch, not merely seeking treatment for sick animals, but hoping to learn her methods themselves. What had once been a source of fear and vulnerability slowly transformed into something Evelyn had never dared imagine, a legacy freely given exactly as her grandfather would have wanted. Nathan built a small schoolhouse-style structure near the barn specifically for her lessons, watching with quiet pride as his wife, once so guarded and afraid, blossomed into a confident, respected teacher throughout the territory. One crisp autumn evening, nearly 6 months after Richard Blackwood's disappearance, Nathan and Evelyn sat together on their porch, watching the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and gold across land that had become unmistakably theirs. "Do you ever think about him?" Nathan asked quietly. "Richard, I mean." Evelyn considered the question carefully before answering. "Less and less," she admitted. "There was a time I thought I'd spend my whole life looking over my shoulder waiting for him to reappear. But I think I finally understand something." "What's that?" "Men like Richard build their entire lives around controlling other people," Evelyn said. "The moment he lost control over me, he lost the only thing that ever gave him power in the first place. Wherever he is now, running from whatever's left of his reputation, I imagine he's far more haunted by his own choices than I've ever been by mine." Nathan squeezed her hand gently. "And you? What haunts you now?" Evelyn turned to him, her expression soft and unguarded in a way that would have been impossible for the frightened woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach with a locked chest clutched desperately to her chest. "Nothing," she said honestly. "For the first time in my entire life, nothing haunts me at all." Nathan pulled her closer, resting his chin gently atop her head as they watched the sun disappear below the horizon. "I used to think I wrote that advertisement because I was tired of an empty house," he said quietly. "But I think the truth is, I was tired of an empty life. I just didn't know it until you stepped off that stagecoach and warned me not to touch your box." Evelyn laughed softly, the sound warm and genuine. "I nearly turned around and got back on that stagecoach the moment I saw the look on your face." "Why didn't you?" "Because you didn't ask a single question," she said. "You just said, 'All right, it's yours.' And something about that told me maybe, just maybe, I'd finally found somewhere safe to stop running." Nathan tilted her chin gently upward, meeting her eyes with a quiet certainty that had only deepened through every trial they'd faced together. "You didn't just find somewhere safe, Evelyn," he said softly. "You found somewhere you belong." Evelyn's eyes glistened with emotion, but for once the tears threatening to fall were not born from fear or grief. They were born from the simple, unshakable certainty of a woman who had finally completely come home. Because in the end, the greatest gift Evelyn Harper had ever carried within that small wooden chest wasn't the knowledge passed down from her grandfather, nor the remedies that had saved countless animals throughout the territory. It was the courage to stop hiding, to stand fully in the truth of who she was, and to trust completely unconditionally that some people are worth staying for. And on the Walker Ranch, beneath a Montana sky painted brilliant with the colors of a hard-won sunset, that truth would remain unshaken for the rest of their days.